The British government is in absolute freefall. Right, 1 minute ago, something absolutely unprecedented just happened on live BBC television that has sent shockwaves through Westminster and across the entire United Kingdom. Tom Hardy, one of Britain's most respected and beloved actors, just did what no celebrity has dared to do in modern British politics. He challenged Keir Starmer directly on camera in front of millions of viewers, and what he said has left the Prime Minister visibly shaken and the entire political establishment in absolute panic mode. This wasn't a scripted interview. This wasn't a planned political appearance. This was a spontaneous confrontation that nobody saw coming, and it's already being called the most explosive moment in British political television history. Hardy was appearing on a BBC morning programme to discuss his charity work with military veterans and their families, a cause he's been passionate about for years. It was supposed to be a light, feel-good segment about supporting those who served. But when the conversation turned to government funding cuts for veteran services, something in Tom Hardy snapped. He looked directly into the camera and called out Keir Starmer by name, demanding answers about why his government has slashed support for the very people who sacrificed everything for this country. And he didn't stop there. What followed was 3 minutes of the most raw, unfiltered, passionate criticism of government policy ever broadcast on mainstream British television. Hardy tore into Starmer's broken promises to veterans. He exposed the gap between what Labour said they would do and what they're actually doing. He called out the hypocrisy of a Prime Minister who talks about honouring service while cutting the budgets that provide real support to struggling veterans and their families. And he did it all with the intensity and conviction that has made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Except this wasn't acting. This was genuine fury from a man who has spent years working directly with veterans and who knows firsthand the devastating impact of government neglect. The BBC hosts were absolutely stunned. They tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but Hardy wasn't having it. He kept pressing, kept challenging, kept demanding that someone in government explain why veterans are being abandoned. And then he issued a direct challenge to Keir Starmer. Come on this programme, face the veterans you've betrayed and explain yourself to the British people. The gauntlet has been thrown down. A beloved public figure with massive credibility on this issue has publicly challenged the Prime Minister to defend his policies in front of the people they affect. And Starmer is in an impossible position. If he accepts the challenge, he'll be grilled by someone who knows the facts inside and out and who won't accept political spin as answers. If he refuses, he looks like a coward who's afraid to defend his own policies. Either way, Tom Hardy has just created a political crisis that Starmer cannot ignore and cannot spin away. Social media is absolutely exploding right now. The clip of Hardy's challenge has been viewed millions of times in the past hour. Veterans organisations are rallying behind Hardy's message. Ordinary Brits are expressing shock and admiration that a celebrity actually used his platform to demand real accountability from politicians. And Westminster is in chaos as MPs from all parties scramble to respond to a story that's dominating every conversation in the country. This is bigger than just one issue or one policy debate. This is a cultural moment where someone with massive public credibility has called out the fundamental dishonesty and callousness of the political class. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal about Hardy's challenge and the issue behind it will show you exactly why this moment matters and why Keir Starmer's response will define his entire premiership. Let me give you the full context of what just happened and why Tom Hardy's intervention is so devastating for Keir Starmer, because this story has been building for months and Hardy's challenge brings it all to a head in the most public way possible. OW documents have been leaked. Tom Hardy has been involved in veterans advocacy for over a decade. He's not some celebrity jumping on a trendy cause for publicity. He's been quietly doing the work, visiting veterans facilities, fundraising for support organisations, personally mentoring former service members struggling with PTSD and transition to civilian life. He's one of the patrons of the Royal British Legion and several smaller veterans charities. People who work in this sector describe him as genuinely committed and knowledgeable about the issues veterans face. So when he speaks about veterans policy, he's not expressing vague concern based on headlines. He's speaking from deep personal knowledge of what's actually happening on the ground. And what's happening is a catastrophe that Keir Starmer's government is directly responsible for. During the election campaign, Labour made extensive promises about supporting veterans. Starmer personally pledged to increase funding for veterans' mental health services, to improve transition support for service members leaving the military, to address the scandal of veteran homelessness, and to ensure that those who served would never be abandoned by their country. These promises were prominent in Labour's campaign materials, especially in constituencies with large military populations. Veterans and their families voted Labour in significant numbers based on these specific commitments. And now, less than a year into government, Starmer has broken every single one of those promises. The budget released 3 months ago contained devastating cuts to veterans' services. Mental health programs had their funding slashed by 30%. Transition support services lost 40% of their budget. Homelessness prevention programs for veterans were eliminated entirely. Organisations that provide employment assistance, housing support, and family services have been forced to close programs and lay off staff. The impact on real veterans and their families has been immediate and severe. Wait times for mental health treatment have doubled. Veterans in crisis are being turned away because there aren't enough counsellors or beds. Families are losing their homes because support programs that helped with housing no longer exist. Former service members who were getting help finding employment are now on their own. This isn't about statistics or budget lines. This is about real people who serve their country and who are now being abandoned in their time of need by a government that promised to support them. And Tom Hardy has seen all of this up close. He visits these facilities. He talks to these veterans. He hears their stories. He knows their names and their struggles. So when he went on BBC this morning to discuss his charity work and the hosts asked a standard question about government support for veterans, Hardy couldn't stay silent anymore. He'd been watching the gap between Starmer's promises and Starmer's actions grow wider and wider, watching veterans suffer because of broken commitments, and he finally decided that someone with a platform needed to speak truth to power. What he said on air was devastating in its directness and its factual accuracy. He started by pointing out the specific promises Labour made during the campaign. He quoted from their manifesto. He referenced speeches Starmer gave to veterans groups. He laid out exactly what was pledged. And then he contrasted those promises with the actual budget decisions. He cited the specific percentage cuts to each programme. He named organisations that have had to close. He described real veterans he personally knows who have been impacted by these cuts. The juxtaposition between what was promised and what was delivered was so stark, so undeniable that even the BBC hosts couldn't spin it. They tried. One host suggested that budget constraints from the previous government forced difficult decisions, but Hardy shut that down immediately. He pointed out that Labour chose to find money for other priorities, that the government had increased spending on various programmes while slashing support for veterans. This wasn't about lacking resources. This was about choosing not to prioritise the people who served. Another host tried to suggest that perhaps the cuts would be temporary and funding would be restored in future budgets. Hardy's response was withering. He said that veterans in crisis can't wait for future budgets. They need help now. They were promised help now. And telling them to wait while their mental health deteriorates or they lose their housing is a betrayal of the most fundamental obligation government has to those who served. The power of Hardy's critique came from its moral clarity and its grounding in specific facts. This wasn't vague criticism about government priorities. This was a precise indictment backed by evidence that anyone could verify, and it came from someone whose credibility on this issue is unimpeachable. Hardy isn't a political partisan. He's donated to and supported candidates from different parties over the years. He's not known for political activism. This was clearly someone who had been pushed to speak out because he'd witnessed something so wrong that silence was no longer an option. That authenticity is what made his challenge to Starmer so powerful and so impossible to dismiss as political theatre. When Hardy looked directly at the camera and challenged Starmer to come on the programme and defend these cuts to the veterans who are affected, it was a moment of pure moral authority confronting political calculation. Hardy was saying, if you really believe these cuts are justified, if you really think you're doing right by veterans, then come here and say it to their faces. Explain to someone who lost both legs in Afghanistan why his mental health support has been cut. Tell a widow whose husband killed himself after returning from Iraq why the counselling programme that might have saved him no longer has funding. Look veterans in the eye and tell them why the promises you made don't matter now that you've got their votes. The challenge was structured in a way that makes it almost impossible for Starmer to refuse without looking terrible, but equally impossible to accept without facing devastating consequences, because Hardy didn't just challenge Starmer to a debate. He challenged him to face real veterans, real families, real people whose lives have been damaged by these policy decisions. If Starmer accepts, the BBC will fill that studio with veterans who have been impacted by the cuts. They'll ask him direct questions about why their services were eliminated. They'll share their stories of struggling without support. They'll ask him to reconcile his promises with his actions. And there's no spin that works in that situation. No political talking points that sound acceptable when you're looking at someone who sacrificed for their country and is now being abandoned by their government. Starmer would be eviscerated and every moment would be captured on camera for millions to see. But if Starmer refuses Hardy's challenge, he looks like a coward who's afraid to defend his own policies. He proves that he knows his decisions are indefensible. He confirms that veterans aren't a priority for him. And he gives Hardy and veterans organisations an ongoing story about the Prime Minister who won't face the people he's betrayed. The political brilliance of Hardy's intervention is that he's created a no-win situation for Starmer while doing so in a way that's completely genuine and principled. This isn't a calculated political trap, it's a sincere demand for accountability. But the effect is to put Starmer in an impossible bind where every option makes him look bad. And the timing couldn't be worse for the Prime Minister. He's already dealing with multiple scandals. His approval ratings are terrible. Public trust in his government is at historic lows. And now he's being publicly challenged by one of Britain's most beloved actors on an issue where Starmer is clearly in the wrong and where the facts are undeniably on Hardy's side. The veterans issue is also one where public sympathy is overwhelmingly with the people being harmed by government cuts. Brits might disagree about lots of political issues, but there's near universal agreement that veterans deserve support. The public has enormous respect and gratitude for those who serve in the military, and they're absolutely furious when they learn that government has broken promises to veterans. Hardy's challenge taps into that fury and gives it a focal point. Within hours of the broadcast, veterans organisations released statements supporting Hardy's challenge and calling on Starmer to accept. The Royal British Legion issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about funding cuts and hoping for dialogue between government and those affected. Smaller veterans' charities were less diplomatic, with several directly endorsing Hardy's call for Starmer to face veterans and explain himself. Serving members of the military and veterans have flooded social media with messages thanking Hardy for speaking up and sharing their own stories of how the cuts have affected them or people they know. The groundswell of support for Hardy's position is massive and it's building by the hour. The political establishment's response to Hardy's challenge has been absolutely chaotic and revealing. Within an hour of the broadcast, opposition parties were issuing statements supporting Hardy's demand for answers and using the moment to attack Starmer's broken promises to veterans. The Conservative Party released a statement pointing out that they had actually increased veterans funding in their final budgets and that Labour's cuts represent a betrayal of campaign promises. Reform UK's Nigel Farage gave an impromptu press conference praising Hardy's courage and calling on all MPs to demand answers from Starmer about why veterans are being abandoned. Even Liberal Democrat MPs, usually cautious about jumping on trending controversies, issued statements expressing concern and calling for restoration of veterans funding. The united cross-party support for Hardy's position shows how politically toxic this issue is for Starmer. When politicians from across the spectrum all agree that you've done something wrong, you're in serious trouble. But the most telling response has been from within Labour itself. Multiple Labour backbenchers have given interviews expressing surprise and concern about the extent of the cuts to veterans' services. Several MPs who represent constituencies with large military populations have issued statements promising to raise the issue with party leadership. Two junior ministers with responsibility for Veterans Affairs have conspicuously avoided defending the cuts, instead offering vague statements about reviewing programmes and ensuring adequate support. The lack of a coordinated defence from Labour suggests that even Starmer's own party recognises these cuts are indefensible and that Hardy has touched a nerve that they cannot simply spin away. Starmer's personal response, or rather his lack thereof, has been equally revealing. His office issued a brief written statement several hours after Hardy's challenge, claiming that the government remains committed to supporting veterans and that any budget decisions were made carefully to ensure the most effective use of resources. The statement did not address Hardy's specific challenge to appear on television and face veterans. It did not explain how cutting 30 to 40% from critical support services represents commitment to veterans. It did not reconcile the campaign promises with the budget reality. It was a non-response that satisfied nobody and reinforced the impression that Starmer is hiding from accountability. The contrast between Hardy's passionate, specific, factual challenge and Starmer's bland, evasive written statement could not be more stark. One man speaking from moral conviction with detailed knowledge of the issue, the other hiding behind carefully lawyered PR language that says nothing while trying to make the controversy disappear. The British public can see the difference and they're making their judgments accordingly. Social media has been absolutely brutal towards Starmer's response. Thousands of users have posted side-by-side comparisons of Hardy's challenge and Starmer's statement, highlighting how weak and evasive the Prime Minister looks. Others have compiled video of Starmer's campaign promises to veterans, alongside news reports about the cuts, creating devastating contrast that makes the betrayal undeniable. The hashtags supporting Hardy and demanding answers from Starmer have been trending nationwide for hours, and perhaps most damaging, mainstream media outlets are picking up the story in a way they rarely do with celebrity political commentary. Because Hardy's credibility on this issue is so strong and because the facts so clearly support his critique. The BBC itself has been in an interesting position. They aired Hardy's challenge live, and it's created a huge story that's driving viewership and engagement. But they're also aware that this puts them in the middle of a political controversy and that Starmer's team will be unhappy with them for giving Hardy the platform. So far, they've handled it by continuing to cover the story extensively while trying to maintain journalistic balance by inviting government representatives to respond. But those government representatives have been terrible, offering the same weak defences that Starmer's written statement provided and often looking visibly uncomfortable when pressed on specifics. The BBC has also started reaching out to veterans organisations and affected individuals to get their perspectives, which has only made the story worse for Starmer because every veteran they interview confirms Hardy's account of how devastating the cuts have been. There's also been fascinating discussion about what it means when a celebrity intervention has more impact than years of advocacy by veterans organisations and political opposition. Many veterans groups have been raising these exact concerns for months. They've issued reports, held press conferences, lobbied MPS, done everything that advocacy organisations are supposed to do. And while their work got some attention, it never broke through to become a major national story. But Tom Hardy says essentially the same things on a morning talk show, and within hours it's the biggest political story in the country. What does that say about British politics and media? Some argue it's depressing that we need celebrities to amplify important issues before they get attention. Others counter that Hardy is using his celebrity platform responsibly and that his intervention is valuable precisely because it brings attention to issues that were being ignored. Both perspectives have merit, And the discussion itself is useful for thinking about how political accountability works in modern media environment. But regardless of how we got here, the fact is that Tom Hardy has succeeded in making veterans policy a crisis issue for Starmer's government in a way that nothing else did. The Prime Minister can no longer ignore this. He can't wait for the story to blow over. He has to respond in some meaningful way. And every option available to him is bad. If he accepts Hardy's challenge and appears on television to face veterans, he'll be destroyed. The facts aren't on his side. The moral high ground isn't on his side. He'll be confronted by people who sacrificed enormously for their country and who are being let down by his broken promises. There's no spinning that, no political communication strategy that makes that look good. If he declines the challenge, he proves he's afraid to defend his own policies. He confirms that veterans aren't a priority. He gives Hardy and veterans advocates an ongoing talking point about the Prime Minister who won't face the people he's betrayed. And he opens himself up to continued pressure from opposition parties who will demand he explain why he's refusing to address these concerns publicly. The third option is to reverse the cuts and restore funding to veterans' services. This would neutralise the immediate crisis, but would cost Starmer politically in different ways. It would be an admission that the cuts were wrong. It would embolden other groups fighting budget cuts to demand reversals. It would make Starmer look weak and reactive, changing policy based on celebrity pressure rather than principled decision-making. And it would raise serious questions about his judgment. Why he approved cuts that were so obviously wrong, he had to reverse them within months. None of these options are good for Starmer, which is exactly what makes Hardy's intervention so politically effective. The broader context of this confrontation is also important to understand. Starmer's government has been cutting various social services and support programmes while claiming budget constraints require difficult decisions, but they found money for other priorities that critics argue are less important than supporting veterans or other vulnerable groups. Hardy touched on this in his BBC appearance, pointing out that choices are being made about what to fund and what to cut. And those choices reveal values and priorities. When you cut support for veterans while increasing spending on pet projects, you're saying veterans aren't a priority. That's a values statement, not a budget necessity. And it's a values statement that most Brits find repulsive. The idea that people who risk their lives for the country should be abandoned while government spends money on things that don't matter as much is morally offensive to most citizens. Hardy articulated this moral argument with clarity and passion, and it's resonating deeply across the country. There's also a generational and class dimension to this story that makes it particularly interesting. Tom Hardy is 50-something, working-class background, came up through British drama schools, represents a certain kind of British masculinity that values duty and loyalty and standing up for what's right. His persona, both on screen and off, is someone who doesn't back down from fights and who defends the vulnerable.